Good afternoon. Welcome to Hudson Institute and to what I believe will be a stimulating discussion. India and US have an old relationship, actually going back to India's national struggle when President FDR supported the Indian national movement. However, the relationship was never strategic or defense-oriented during the Cold War. For the last 20 years, however, every successive American president and Indian prime minister has referred to the other country as a natural ally, two nations conceived in liberty, global partner with strategic convergence. And President Obama even referred to India and the US as the defining partnership of the 21st century. However, I'm sure most of us in this room would agree that we are far from being that, even though we appear to be moving in that direction. I'll introduce each of our panelists, and then I'll request them to speak for about 5 minutes before we have a discussion. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy is the Director General of Delhi-based Institute for Defense and Strategic Analysis, a career diplomat of the Indian Foreign Service. He was India's ambassador to Japan, Republic of Marshall Islands, ambassador to Mexico, and High Commissioner to Belize. Benjamin Schwartz leads the U.S. India Business Council's Defense and Aerospace Program. Ben previously served in a range of positions within the U.S. national security community, including at Department of State, Energy and Defense. Vikram Singh is Senior Advisor to the Asia Program at USIP and also at U.S. India Strategic Policy Forum. From 2014 to 2017, Vikram was Vice President for National Security at Center for American Progress and previously Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Ambassador Chinoy, I'd like to start with you. If you could provide the lay of the land of where India-US relations are today.
Thank you, Aparna, and it's good to be part of this panel this afternoon with notable experts like Ben and Vikram. They will do a lot more of the talking. But from my side, let me begin by saying that India and the United States have very strong bonds that essentially are predicated on the fact that India is the world's largest and most populous democracy, and the United States is the world's oldest democracy. But for long, we have been estranged from one another until destiny has brought us together. So I begin by saying that fate conspired in the 1950s, 60s, 70s to keep us apart, but the changing global situation, the changing regional situation means that we have a common and shared destiny as well. Now, I believe that there were policies that both had adopted in those early days after India's independence that served to keep us apart. There were hurdles. India followed then a very strong policy of non-alignment. It was bordering on the idealistic. We were not part of CENTO, SEATO, whereas the United States at that point of time was quite obsessed and focused with stemming the rise of communism. In the 60s, when relations, in our case, deteriorated with China and much more so with Pakistan as well, the United States had a defense relationship with Pakistan, which also came in the way. We saw that hurdle in 1965 when some of these armaments given to Pakistan were used against India. 1971 was also yet another roadblock in my view when the 7th Fleet had sailed into the Bay of Bengal. But let me assure you that all that is simply water under the bridge, because today, as I say, as I put it, destiny has brought us together. We live in a very, very transformed world, one in which there has been mercurial and telescopic change in the past few decades. So we have a situation today in which the United States of America and China have a very complex relationship. And in Asia, we have witnessed the simultaneous rise of several countries. In first flush, of course, it was the People's Republic of China that grew very rapidly over 30 years at unbridled growth rates of 9% or more. But the rest of Asia is also showing ferment and very high rates of growth consistently over extended periods. India is among those countries that is growing very rapidly. India has emerged as one of the world's largest economies and fastest growing emerging economies. We today cherish the fact that India and the United States have a very robust global strategic partnership. And what has really changed is the circumstances. We no longer have a semblance of equilibrium earlier provided by the Cold War, no longer a situation in which there was a sole superpower, as was the case in the 1990s. We have a much more complex situation in which there is obviously a move towards some kind of multipolarity at the global level, and so also a struggle for multipolarity at the Asian level. Within this context, our relationship, the Defense Policy Group, which was set up in 1995, has finally come of age. And today, India has been recognized by the United States as a major defense partner, a non-NATO ally. There is a special rapid reaction group in the Pentagon that fast-tracks technology for India. We have the India Amendment in the National Defense Authorization Act. And there are many special such carve-outs that permit rapidly emerging defense partnership, which has resulted in our purchasing something like US $18 billion worth of modern platforms from the United States. We have foundational agreements in place now, 3 of them. We have the GSOMIA as early as 2002. We have the LEMOA in 2016 and the COMCASA in 2018. Quite apart from that, the largest number of exercises between the armed forces that India conducts is with the United States of America. And there is a growing convergence that we have with regard to our vision for the Indo-Pacific in terms of the narratives for peace, prosperity, and development, particularly the kind of developmental finance model for creating infrastructure and connectivity that we wish to offer to the region. There will be hurdles along the way because we need to create the right kind of receptacles at both ends to make that fit better. We must discuss our expectations, what we expect of one another. The pace will have to be mutually comfortable. And meanwhile, we should continue to do what we are doing, which is exercising together, trying to create interoperability in terms of the equipment. As we draw down on our Soviet era equipment, we go in for multiple sources. The United States is one of our biggest defense partners today. These are my brief opening remarks, but I shall be happy to come in later again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Vikram?
Well, thank you, and Ambassador, pleasure to be with you. Ben, good to be with you too, and thanks to Hudson for doing this. It's great. I like seeing the focus Hudson is putting in this area, and I'm glad to see you guys thinking about more and more ways to feature India and South Asia writ large. You know, I wouldn't disagree with anything the ambassador has said. I think we remain, I've been using this line, you know, perhaps too much lately, but it's sort of, I say, how can something so right feel so wrong? So it's, you know, the partnership is clearly the right thing to do, but it often struggles with sort of an unexpected degree of friction. If it's the defining partnership of the 21st century, you would expect there to be both a lot more attention, a lot more focus, and honestly a lot more rapid progress. But then if you step back as someone who's worked on this relationship for a long time, you have to remember that in 2005, if you had said that India would purchase $18 billion of military hardware from the United States, you would have been laughed out of the room, right? So is it, you know, is the glass half full or the glass half empty? I think it is half full, largely because of what the ambassador is saying. Strategically, we are just more and more aligned. It is very difficult at this point to imagine the United States wanting India to come out on the losing end of any kind of strategic confrontation in its region. The United States would have a hard time seeing the Asia-Pacific shaping up, free and open Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, however you want to frame it. It's hard to see that shaping up without India as sort of the anchor of stability on the western side of the Pacific and the heart of the Indo-Pacific area, if you are looking at the Indian Ocean region as a strategic construct. But the United States still is basically mostly focused on Northeast Asia, and the Indians are mostly focused on their immediate neighborhood, which is potentially a nice division of labor, as it were. So the U.S. is thinking, we need India to be actually powerful, to have a capable military, to have the power projection capabilities, to have blue water Navy capabilities, to have everything from undersea to space assets available for awareness, situational awareness throughout the area. We need India to be able to be a big power if it's going to play a big role. And that is one of the things that has actually undergirded a pushing of the U.S. system to facilitate things for India. Indians don't necessarily recognize that more than with any other country, the United States practices what I would call an Indian exceptionalism. So no other country has been told, yes, you cannot be in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we will now go to bat and fight everybody else in the treaty to get you in to the 4 major non-proliferation regimes. I mean, that's unique to India in the history of the world. So take that from multiple U.S. administrations have pushed that forward until the Indians are only out of the nuclear suppliers group, but have basically come into everything else, really as a function of U.S. pressure. This is not something China or Germany or anybody else wanted to have happen. It's just been steady cajoling by the United States to say, come on, let's recognize India as a responsible nuclear power. Similarly, we go out of our way to come up with ways to make things work for India in the U.S. system. So, you know, a Kamkasa by any other name would smell as sweet, but we had to find a name that works for India. We have to find ways, you know, Lockheed is selling an F-21, not an F-16. It's a major defense partnership, a categorization that's unique to India. So in a way, India is a demanding partner. Not because it's asking for difficult things, because it just wants to make it clear that it is strategically independent. For India, the point is it's not an ally of the United States. It does not want to be in a club with NATO. It does not want to be in a club with Japan and Australia. It wants to maintain a strategically independent position, which includes a very strong partnership with the United States because of the shared interests of the two countries. And that's a little bit complicated for Americans to handle. For the United States, it sort of says, hey, we agree on most of this stuff, so let's do it together. And the Indians say, well, let's do more things together and see, but let's not overstate things, right? We may agree with you that we don't want a nuclear Iran, but we certainly don't agree with your approach to it, right? Whether that was bullying and sanctioning to get into an Iran nuclear deal, or now the opposite tack in the United States, which is bullying and sanctioning because it's gotten out of a nuclear deal, right? From the Indian perspective, that's something you want to keep your distance from. Even Myanmar was really interesting. When I was in government, we were really pushing on. We went from really pushing the pressure campaign on Myanmar to really pushing the let's open up and embrace this change that's happening in Myanmar. And all along, the Indians had always said, don't do so much pressure. You have to engage with them. Be pragmatic. The opportunities will come. And at the end of the day, the United States thinks that the pressure campaign worked, and the Indians think that the careful engagement worked. And of course, what really happened is things changed in Myanmar. And neither of us were dispositive on that. But it shows that we have similar objectives and different approaches in not just many, but I would say probably most situations. That even terrorism out of Pakistan. There's no gulf in our understanding of what's going on with regard to terrorism out of Pakistan, and honestly, there never has been. There was the immediate post 9/11 need of the United States to utilize Pakistani territory to access Afghanistan, which resulted in a lot of shifting of U.S. policy towards Pakistan, including the major non-NATO ally status. But that was directly related to needing to conduct a war in Afghanistan, to which we have only two ways in, through Russia or through Pakistan. But the understanding was always there. It was just that our approach varied from firm but leave a door open to embrace and try to give a lot of aid and try to see if you can get Pakistan to quote-unquote change its strategic calculus, where, as the Indians have simply said consistently, Pakistan's not going to change its strategic calculus. It needs to be pressured until something breaks. And those are both valid points, but they're completely at odds when it comes to how to approach that particular challenge. What I would say now is that there is no doubt that this will be an enduring partnership. Some of the agreements that we've put in place, including things like Kamkasa, are going to change the nature of the relationship such that, for example, India is able to benefit from real-time geospatial intelligence or real-time intelligence on movements of forces and things like that. Things that would make a Doklam situation, or even what just happened in the Pulwama attacks, potentially less likely, and give India a better situational awareness for its responding. So the fact is, these are not small shifts. The nature of information available to India, and hopefully the nature of Indian information available to the United States, these are supposed to be two-way streets, is going to be such that we will find ourselves operationally needing each other even more and benefiting from the partnership even more than we have in recent years. We are moving to a much more mature phase of the defense partnership. And I think that bodes really well amid what might be political challenges or political headwinds, because operationally, there'll be a lot more that's benefiting both sides, and there'll be a lot more to lose if we somehow go off the rails. That said, I think there's a lot to worry about. While we view China much in the same light, again, we have a very different approach. And as the United States as India is wrapped up like every other country in trade or sanctions issues emanating from the United States, you can already see Indian strategic thinkers saying, okay, well, what's one hedge, and how do we play that vis-a-vis China? And so I think this is, I expect to see actually a lot more engagement with China by New Delhi in the coming 6 or 12 months, and potentially less coherence between our two countries on that front. I'll end with that.
Thanks, Vikram. Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you for the opportunity to join this group. It's a great thing that an organization like Hudson provides a platform to hear the perspective of really stellar, intellectual leaders in India's diplomatic corps, and to give that opportunity to the audience. So, the topic of the moment, U.S. India strategic partnership. Often we think about the trajectory of this partnership by looking at, say, the national interests of the United States, or the interests of the Trump administration, and then the interests of the Indian government or the Modi government, and saying, okay, where is there convergence? Where is there overlap? And then once you identify that space, you say, okay, how do we focus on that? How do we expand that area of convergence and overlap? And we've all used that approach to thinking about this relationship, and it has utility, but I'm going to offer a different way of thinking about the relationship. And that is, if we step outside the confines of sort of the bilateral relationship and the dialogue among India hands, and we think about the issues that are of pressing concern to decision makers in Washington, D.C. and in Delhi, really these are exogenous factors. These are exogenous issues like, say, Iran policy, or Russia policy, or trade policy, or an issue that I spend a considerable amount of time focused on, which is defense industrial base policy. All of these issues, right, are not inherent. They're not part of the bilateral relationship, but they will have a huge impact on that relationship. And this isn't just something sort of new. If you look back at U.S.-India relations, it's often these exogenous factors that come in and have huge impacts. So, one of the most, significant policy decisions, right, was in 1998, where you had the nuclear weapons test and the reaction from the United States government. And what that really was about was the U.S. government had a non-proliferation policy. And then it said, okay, how does India and that test fit into the non-proliferation policy? It's been rarer, although Vikram has noted a number of instances in which this isn't the case, but it's been rare in which the U.S. has had a India policy and then tried to figure out how the non-proliferation policy or the Iran policy or the Russia policy or the trade policy fit into the India policy. So if we look at these, say, exogenous factors right now, let's say Russia, what is this town's policy towards Russia? It could have a huge impact on where we go with U.S.-India ties. And to make that less abstract, I mean, Congress has legislation through CATSA, right, that is a global policy. Now, I've made the case, and others have, that in the context of U.S.-India ties, it's not just a bad policy, but it flies against the original purpose of the legislation. It's counterproductive. It's not just neutral. If you look at the amount of deals that have been sort of agreed to between the Indian government and the Russian government since CATSA was penned, it's far more than in the previous 8 years, right? So just objectively, if the goal of a legislation like CATSA was to deprive the Russian government of hard currency, it's demonstrably been ineffective in the context of U.S.-India ties. But in a way, this doesn't always matter because, as I said, the primary concerns of decision makers in capitals has often been not the bilateral relationship, but these other issues. And sometimes the U.S.-India relationship is a beneficiary of those decisions, and sometimes it's a casualty. So I can think of 4 or 5 issues that I've laid out today. For example, China, what's going with China. It could be that the U.S.-India relationship is a beneficiary of the trade tensions with China right now because it's going to really encourage the United States to look towards India to be a partner in areas where it hadn't in the past because it has to sort of find alternatives. When it comes to Iran, that it may be a casualty. We see where the oil sanctions are in place to see what happens after the Indian elections. One issue, as I said, that I spend a considerable amount of time thinking about is this issue of defense industrial base consideration. What is defense industrial base? What do I mean by that? Well, there's a narrative that's been developed in Washington. It's a story about the theft of hundreds of billions of dollars in cutting-edge U.S. defense equipment. And the narrative goes something like this. Over the last decade or so, and these numbers come from the Defense Department, somewhere between $200 and $350 billion annually has been stolen from the United States, either through cyber crimes or through intellectual property fraud. And we've got to figure out a way to arrest this trend. Just to give those numbers in context, the estimated Chinese annual defense budget is somewhere between 180 and $260 billion. So the theft actually is substantially larger than one of America's most significant strategic competitors' defense budget. Now, the second part of this narrative is not only is the technology at risk, but the supply chain of American defense industrial base is at risk because so much of the sourcing that we get comes from other parts of the world or from areas that we don't have control over. So this is a discussion about U.S.-India. Why am I talking about this? Well, one of the pillars, and it's been noted, of the U.S.-India relationship in recent years has been defense. And within that general construct of defense, one of the key components has been defense industrial collaboration. So if we're entering an era where the U.S. is going to construct new walls, new barriers, and I don't just mean along our borders, but between our industry and foreign industries, the question in my mind is, which side of that barrier will India be on? Is India going to be inside the camp with the United States and our closest defense industrial partners like the Canadians, the Brits, and others? Or is India going to be on the other side of this cyber wall? With the Russians and the Chinese and others. Now, this is a complicated issue in a way. There's a lot of ways to think about it. But I think when thinking about, as we are here today, the trajectory of U.S.-India ties, it's instructive and clarifying, I think, to try to get outside of that sort of the U.S. India sort of exclusive focus and think about these larger issues or different issues that are occupying a lot of time of decision makers here in Washington. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I have a few questions I'd like to ask the panel, and then I'll open it up. I'll start with something Ambassador Chinoy said. India's always been more comfortable with a multipolar world and multiple alignments, issue-based relationships, bilateral relationships. That is what we prefer. However, the way sort of, if we look at it from the defense side, India has purchased about $18 billion worth of equipment, but India prefers to purchase from multiple sources, whether it's oil or it's defense equipment. We like multiple baskets. However, there's an argument made by people which goes this way, that if you want the benefits from interoperability, if you want the benefits from American equipment, you need to purchase primarily from one source and not from multiple sources. If you purchase from multiple sources, your equipment will not really sync. What I'd like to ask each of you is, sort of, do you agree with the argument that India should purchase from multiple sources, or do you believe that at some stage India will have to sort of purchase, especially its big platforms, only from one vendor, if it seeks to benefit, sort of get the technology, the industrial base, and the software which come with that equipment? Start with Ambassador Chinoy.
Thank you, Aparna. That's a very pertinent question, but one that cannot be posited in isolation of history. So it's not a theoretical or academic question whether India should have all platforms in sync in one fell swoop overnight. Now, when you look at India's history of defense acquisitions, you would know for the most part that, as I said before, that India being out of CENTO, SEATO, the complex relationship between the United States and Pakistan in the 60s, and the subsequent peaceful nuclear explosion, as it was known, the PNE in 1974, more subsequently the nuclear tests of 1998. Now, all these are actually, sort of milestones in an evolutionary process in which India was actually denied technologies. We were at the wrong end of the US system. You're aware of that. Now, you're also aware of the fact that India is a developing country which requires to be adequately and sufficiently sort of equipped with modern arms, but that there is also the question of affordability. And over time, we have, through this entire evolutionary process, acquired license production rights in India of certain large-scale equipment of first Soviet and later Russian origin. There has been transfer of technology, and India has been manufacturing many, many large and sophisticated systems ranging from the MiGs to the Su-30s. We have collaborated to develop the BrahMos supersonic missile. So when you look at this construct, you would realize that it is not a very easy matter to simply say that today we wake up and have all equipment on the same platform, interoperability, etc. That's the first point. The second point, very quickly, is that the fact of the matter is that India and the United States have a very robust global strategic partnership today, and there is no gainsaying the fact that this is the partnership of the 21st century. Now, there is a choice here, and if I were to use an analogy from helicopter manufacturing, basically in lighter vein, there used to be a joke that when the Russians built a helicopter, they first built the helicopter and then found some place amidst the wires and the steel and the planks and everything for the pilot to squeeze himself in and sit somewhere. And then there is the American way of building a helicopter, which is to first make a beautiful cushion out for the pilot, have a place to keep his Coca-Cola there, his hamburger, hot dog, etc., music, and then see how best you can construct a helicopter around it. Now, In terms of fitting in the United States and India in a defense partnership, we have that choice here. That is the United States taking into account this formidable potential of a strategic partnership with shared values as fellow democracies, willing to work it the way you work your helicopters and other designs, your automobiles, with India being central to that decision? Or is it going to be a one-size-fits-all approach? Having said that, we have to also keep in mind the fact that power cannot be exercised, whether military or economic, in a vacuum. It's always in a certain geographic sense. It's not a spiritual power that you exercise, or an economic power too cannot be exercised spiritually. So when you speak of multipolarity, of regional balance, equilibrium, you're primarily looking at India's potential to emerge as one of the central poles in the emerging dynamics of Asia, where you need stability and equilibrium. So that should be your primary objective. And that primary objective can be achieved by rapid economic growth, by rapid facilitation of defense modernization, and enabling India to play a larger role in the region to begin with. And as India grows, it will play an even bigger role with like-minded countries in the broader region.
Vikram or Ben?
Look, no one would design today's Indian Air Force if the mission was just to have the most effective air power capability that you could have, right? 6 squadrons of different aircraft, different era, different countries, different systems. It doesn't, from different aircraft types from different countries. It is not primarily designed to be the most effective fighting machine. So sure, yeah, standardizing it would be probably operationally better, but India has different objectives, which the ambassador has spoken to, including security through diversification. So at the same time as if you might have a more effective fighting force, but if you have all of your multi-role fighters and your light combat aircraft and your, if they're all from one country and then that country, the United States, for example, let's say it was the United States and it decides it's going to withhold spare parts over some third exogenous issue like sanctions on a country or something like that, you're at great risk. And so I think India has basically practiced the kind of risk management that you would apply to your stock portfolio, which is diversification. And it is not, and multipolarity, a welcoming view. If you look at the rise of a multipolar Asia, India welcomes, embraces, and seeks to be as successful as it can in a multipolar world. The United States resists and seeks to manage the emerging multipolar world. It's a different approach. We see it as a problem because it's displacing us from primacy. India sees it as an environment that is probably better for Indian interests overall because lots of potential friends, and you can manage, and you can be on side on one thing and disagree on another thing, and you'll find somebody, there's a lot of different ways to go. Practically speaking, I don't think anybody thinks India can snap its fingers and shift. And so India is in a position of making conscious decisions. And I think right now what we see is a conscious decision actually to say there's spaces in which we need the benefit is the most valuable to us of this integration. So if you look at P-8s and multi-role helicopters and things that would be useful for, say, anti-submarine warfare, I think you can see a pattern where the Indians are thinking, anti-submarine warfare, the Chinese are building a heck of a lot of submarines that are going to be around. We should probably be good at that. And if you start to add up where you're seeing a lot of progress, and you have Comcasa, then suddenly you are going to have, if Sea Guardian also happens, you are building a much more capable integrated anti-submarine warfare capability. Now at the same time, India is saying our legacy is with Russia on everything from small arms and tanks to our strategic systems. And Russia's not going to want to be abandoned as a partner, and we'll make that clear, I'm sure, in private. And the Indians are not going to have easy ways to make a transition. You can't just change out your nuclear forces, right? And so when it comes to strategic systems, India is going to be on a long road to a transition if there's a transition at all. Same with submarines. It's not like the Americans are rushing out to give India a submarine. So where are they going to go for a submarine? If they want a conventional submarine, then maybe Europe is an option. If they want a nuclear submarine, they're going to go to Russia. And so I think the U.S. and India have reached a point in the relationship where none of these things cause major problems, absent the sanctioning issue with Russia, right? Absent that, Americans are like, okay, you want to buy particular, you've got BrahMos, that's going to be the Russians. Your submarines are going to be the Russians. We kind of get it. There's these fringe areas where we would wish for more progress. So it would be greatly disappointing to the Americans if a non-U.S. platform were chosen for the fighter competition, but it would be more disappointing if it was Russian versus European versus American, right? It's a hierarchy there of how unhappy folks would be. S-400 similarly, this is a major frustration. The United States does not want Turkey to have the S-400, does not want India to have the S-400, and that is an area where India is making a choice because it probably will lose some potential integration of communications and ISR platforms because it has that particular Russian system, because of particular characteristics of that Russian system, right? And on the flip side for India, one, the Americans didn't make an offer when India first asked, and only waited till India had sort of signed on the dotted line before saying, okay, wait, you could have THAAD and Patriot, which is a very bad approach from the American side. I mean, and something that the United States needs to think through. Why do we regularly find ourselves on the back foot because we dragged our feet early and then wait until a situation evolves that we don't like and then try to play catch up? So that's probably not likely to go anywhere. It's also going to be more expensive. India's historic relationship with Russia also leads to some interesting practices. So India is clearly leaning on Western countries to be their partners for a defense industrial base. What they want, they don't want a Russian system or a Chinese system. They want something that's much more like a Western system. But that also means that the Russians get a pass on things like offsets and technology transfer, while Western companies have to meet difficult offset requirements, difficult, have a huge demand. What amount of technology is being transferred? S-400 comes with none of that. S-400 is a Russian deal. All Russians doing everything. India getting no domestic industrial and technology benefit from it, which of course is frustrating for the Western companies and Western governments partnered with India.
So I think there's two questions embedded within the overall diversification point, and that is about what does this mean for Indian military capability, and then what does this mean for U.S.-India defense partnership? So as has been noted already, India's current capability is the product of history. This diversification is the product of a hedging approach that I think diplomatically is understandable given that history. I think generally, though, as has been said, hedging when it comes to military systems is not the same as hedging when it comes to diplomacy, because you end up in basically it's a recipe for a weaker military. Now, the degree of how weak it is depends on the specifics, but generally, as has been noted, if you don't have an integration, you're going to have a weaker capability. And that has been fine, I think, for most of Indian history. If you look at it, there's no real need for that, that more lethal capability. But there's a difference today than there was 10 years ago, and that is the rise of the Chinese military. And so what the U.S. is looking for is to see, is India adjusting to this? Or is the policy just a continuation of the past approach? And the general framework, I think, the hope here in D.C. for the last 5-10 years has been, look, we recognize the limits of the relationship. There's not going to be a formal treaty alliance between the United States and India in the immediate term. But we want to see a defense industrial-based collaboration where it allows India to become more powerful militarily, and that basically provides reassurance to the United States in terms of our integration and ability to operate in the region. And it's not going to be easy, given the history, I think, for the Indian military to move away from Russia. And the Congress and others, like Secretary Mattis, recognized that and pushed Congress to make changes in law that reflect that. But I think DC is also looking for evidence of okay, so if an S-400, what about additional systems? There needs to be some visible shift to sort of keep this, I think, town invested in a long-term change. And or put it a different way, Vikram identified a number of examples of we did a unique Indian exceptionalism, right? And for the India hands, India watchers, we see these general policies that would be bad for the relationship, and we're always like, what's going to happen? Is there going to be an exceptional moment? Are decision makers here in DC going to make an exception for India? And we never know until we get right up to that. Yeah. And for that exception to be made, what you really need is to build political constituencies here in Washington that say, you know, it's worth it. It's worth making that exception. You know, there's different ways of building those constituencies, but it's difficult when you see not just sort of an S-400 on the run, but you see a whole host of other procurements with the Russians. And I think, as I said, it's a recipe for a weaker military, but it's also not a great sign for sort of the continued ability to do this exceptionalism here in town. I'd also add another component, which again is sort of a functional issue. It's a technology issue, and that is, if you look at sort of Indian military requirements, and I'm certainly not an expert on Indian military requirements, but it's not been a high technology requirement, right? India's way of warfare, in a sense, has been to throw mass, at a problem, right? They throw a lot of people, doesn't cost a lot, and that makes a certain amount of sense. But that's not the trend in sort of military evolution, right? The trend in evolution is towards high technology, metric-centric warfare, highly integrated capabilities. So it's the ability to identify targets and then take those targets out, right? It's easier. In other words, it's more important to get that information about where things are than to necessarily have the mass to hit it. And the reforms that we've seen, I think, in the Indian military and where the budget is, and I think I'll just emphasize where the budget is very important, because there's a lot of talking, like in every capital, right? You have the professional talkers, and then you have the bean counters that move money, right? And there's always a disconnect between what the talkers are saying and what the bean counters are doing. And there's that disconnect, I think, to some extent as well, and look, this is not me criticizing India. We do that all the time here in Washington, all the time. But you have people saying, oh, the Chinese military threat, this is a problem. But then you look at where allocation is going to resources, and you're saying, well, where is that reflected in that? So the Indian defense budget last year was about $60 billion, of which about, 43 billion is for really military, what you call the military budget, right? And there was something like an 83% rise in pensions, like in the inflation. Where you have something like maybe a 10% rise in capital acquisition, which compares what Indian planners have said is a gap of 20%. They basically needed a 30% growth in capital acquisition to meet their own requirements. So throwing around numbers, the bottom line here is that we don't necessarily see the Indian military yet being funded in a way that reflects the rise of China, right? There may be, I'm sure if you talk to Indian defense acquisition officials, they'd say, but what about this and the other thing? We've bought these systems, they're clearly targeted at China, and that would all be true. But just, the Chinese military budget, right, according to the Defense Department, has grown at about 10% inflation adjusted a year for 10 years, right? So, at some point, math has its own logic, right? And all this other stuff is sort of a side note to the hard facts of math. So, there's been this, you often get this question about, are we going to return to sort of the G2 model where like the U.S. bypasses India and just goes directly to China? And we all say, no, that's not going to happen because we have this great relationship. There's all these foundational components of U.S. India relations, cultural exchange, English language, trade, defense, all this. It's not going to happen. But I mean, the secret here really is that at a certain point, countries have to be pragmatic. And if in 15 years, you don't have multipolarity in Asia, you have a Sino-centric order, right? Then countries everywhere are going to adjust to that. And what I've written about, frankly, is I call it the multipolar moment, right? We're in a multipolar moment in Asia. And there is this notion, I think, among certain in certain places that this is a self-sustaining scenario, that multipolarity in Asia is going to just continue. I don't think that's the case. Just like the unipolar moment was a moment, in the 90s for the United States. If you just look at the math, right, this is going to be a moment in Asia. And if countries don't adapt to manage this, we're going to be looking at a situation where countries are forced to sort of adapt to the unipolarity of that region.
Could I come in briefly, if you don't mind, just to reflect on one or two points? Firstly, Vikram, all that you said, of course, makes a great deal of sense. But we need to keep in mind that at the global level, there is great uncertainty today. It's a situation that is exceedingly in flux. And countries will factor that flux into their decision-making processes. It's obvious. The second point is that, as Ben said, this is actually a multipolar moment. We are no longer in any unipolar situation. And the putative G2 seems to have played itself out over the years. There was a moment, for instance, in the context of the Indian subcontinent, when India had tested in 1998, that President Clinton had visited Beijing, had a summit with Jiang Zemin, and there had been a joint communique issued on South Asia, referring to the Indian tests and the need to put pressure on India to accede to the NPT and CTBT. But we are long past that moment, because the point of inflection was 2001 and the United States facilitating the rise of China through entry into the WTO, and all that has happened since then, which is in 2012, the ascendance of Xi Jinping, the fact that he has spoken as early as in 2014 to François Hollande in Paris about the Chinese lion having risen, but that it will be pleasant, friendly, and civilized. There are views on how pleasant or how friendly or how civilized things might be in Asia. But it should be nobody's case that multipolarity in Asia is not beneficial for larger stakeholders, extra-regional also, who are actually regional stakeholders like the United States. And India, as one of those important keys to multipolarity in Asia, will ensure stability. The second part is that India has begun a process of modernization and a drawdown of over-reliance on one particular source of equipment. So we have moved from roughly 79% in 2008, 2012 of sourcing equipment that had provenance in Russia to now having roughly 60% of our equipment being sourced of Russian origin. But it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And my last point here is that when you look at the situation in our part of the world, the priorities that we attach to regional security will stem from our threat perceptions. And for India, we have a continental perception of our threats to begin with. I have referred to it as the mandala theory. And the first mandala for us is the continental threats from northern borders or western borders. And then the second mandala is the Indian Ocean and all that goes around in the western and eastern parts of that water body. And then the third mandala takes us towards Southeast Asia and thence to the Pacific. So the priority that we attach to our acquisitions, etc., will also in part be dictated to by our threat perceptions, the history of acquisitions. You might also recall that when India developed in that long arid period, when we were outside the technology regimes, we had really been on the other side, outside the tent. We had begun our integrated missile development program, which is actually one of the great successes of India's military modernization. That too had invited certain whiplash. There were Indian companies and establishments that were on the entities list. Of course, finally, all that is mercifully water under the bridge. Currently, we have to look at current realities and decide for ourselves if we are willing to give this process a chance to reconcile itself over time and move forward.
just two fingers.
We're still answering the first question, Chief.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Just gotta throw that out there as a.
30 seconds, Mr.
Now, I was just going to say, one of the challenges, not just for India, but certainly for the United States, is in managing the rise of China's military, is that democracies don't really evolve or adapt often unless they're really compelled to. There's like a crisis that causes change. And what the Chinese strategy has done very effectively is keep things at such a low simmer that we're sort of like the frog in the kettle. And so both, I think, here in Washington, we're going to have challenges making significant changes to defense acquisition, to other things, in the same way that India is, in the absence of an actual crisis, even though things are building.
I'd like to open up the audience. Please wait for the mic to come to you, and please ask a question, and do mention your name when you do so.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. I have a question for the ambassador. In relation to the education system in India, here in the United States, we have a situation where we're not emphasizing to our children the importance of math and science, especially at the elementary level. And we're more, trying to make sure people are playing football and basketball and different sports and valuing, that's how you get to the good life. And we're not even encouraging our children to look abroad to other countries' education systems and the amount of hours they spend, not in front of a television, but in a classroom, per se. And our children don't even look to India. But what we know is that Indian children are focused on the United States all the time. And my question for you is, how are parents raising their children in India to view the United States, to how they feel about us and what they think about the future of the U.S. India relationship? Thank you very much.
Well, even in the past, when people referred to us as estranged democracies before we actually came together in such a robust manner, there was always a groundswell of goodwill and positive feelings for the United States of America among the people of India. So you must always remember that. The second part is that Indian families have always seen the United States as an El Dorado for higher education, not necessarily for basic education. So I might actually share your viewpoint there, because foundational education, basic education, including at the undergrad level, is often seen as beneficial if one has it in India. But for post-graduation, for high technology subjects, it has always been the United States that's been greatly attractive. But I can assure you that for the United States, there's always been widespread goodwill and support at the popular level. It is the political circumstances, the geopolitics of the day through the decades that conspired to keep us apart for so long. As I say, it's fate that kept us apart, but destiny that's bringing us closer together. So you can rest assured, there's nothing but goodwill towards the U.S.
Actually, most surveys, Pew and Gallup, show that around 70-75% of Indians have a good sort of positive view of U.S., which is much more than for many other countries, even many American allies. Others? Mr. Legari?
I'm Sufi Lagari with the Sindhi Foundation. U.S. and India's partnership, but China and Pakistan's strategic alliance. And the major threat is the terrorism and nuclear threat to the India. I don't know how to the counter to the that threat in the region and also in the Pacific region, rim.
Well, I mean, I think India is doing a relatively good job countering the threat. A few attacks, and often really awful attacks notwithstanding, India has an approach that is to have basically a deterrent posture on nuclear and a deterrent posture on terrorism, which it has been expanding with increasingly, since Mumbai 2008, when India really held back and didn't respond. It's been clearly deciding to say, okay, we're going to do punitive action, targeted, limited, but punitive actions when there's a terrorist attack emanating from Pakistan. What we don't have is a bigger picture vision that we share about how do you sort of get beyond the conveyor belt of terrorism that's generated in Pakistan because of persistent choices of the Pakistani, particularly the Pakistani military, but of the Pakistani state, to operate somewhere between useful proxies and benign neglect of extremists. And that, I think, is an area in which U.S.-India cooperation is really important. Honestly, that's an area in which there might be an angle eventually for China cooperation. I don't know what it's going to take for China, but militants that are a threat to China are certainly also operating in Pakistan. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in this space. There's an effort for the Americans to have an end game in Afghanistan, which could be salutary, or it could result in a big uptick in violence, depending on how things play out. But I think India has taken a fairly firm approach, which is that we're going to, it's somewhere between a U.S. and an Israeli approach to dealing with terrorism. Those are not necessarily strategically effective in ending those threats, but they tend to provide enough security to let life go on.
I'd say that India has a zero tolerance policy towards terrorism, and we've been quite emphatic in this regard. It should surprise no one that the India of today will not accept things the way they were, and we will not tolerate this kind of asymmetrical warfare that's conducted against the state of India by terrorism emanating from the epicenter in Pakistan. And in my view, it's not a benign tolerance of terrorist groups there. It is more like a very conscious effort to use terrorism as part of an asymmetrical toolkit to deal with a superior force across the border.
To be clear, I said useful proxies, that's that part, to benign neglect. So there are groups that are extremists that are not part of the Pakistani toolkit, but that are still operating relatively.
So we are greatly affected. I just quickly add here that as far as the nuclear issue is concerned, you can link the two ends of the spectrum across the Indo-Pacific as well. For you have, for instance, an example of rampant proliferation that has given rise to nuclear capability in Pakistan that later became an open shop for the rest of the world, its linkages to the DPRK at the other end of the spectrum, and then a common point for the two of them as well. So for instance, Japan faces a twin threat at their end of the spectrum. India too has a twin nuclear presence at our end of the spectrum, and there are interlinkages there of proliferation. You can visit the Hiroshima Peace Museum to see that in the Rogues Gallery there, in terms of the proliferators, first and foremost is Dr. A.Q. Khan's visage there. His portrait is very roundly displayed there.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm here at the Hudson Institute. My question's more with the other two facets of the India-US relationship. The first on the economic side and the other on immigration. So if you look at what Ben referred to earlier as the key facets of sort of the political constituencies within Washington, perhaps of closer cooperation with India, traditionally it's been the fact that there's been a strengthening of economic ties over time, especially in the IT sector with outsourcing and all of that. And the second on immigration, especially skilled immigration, where in US was always seen as a place for, as Ambassador Chinoy mentioned, for higher education and then careers for the skilled immigrants, which creates one of the critical constituencies with over 4 million Indian Americans here who are a key pressure group. Now, if you look at either of the countries, there's been a bipartisan consensus on both parties, whoever came into power, in furthering this relationship on these two aspects. However, over the last 20 years, however, for the first time, we're seeing now with this administration, where immigration's gotten a lot harder, and economic ties are also becoming, frayed because of, anti-trade and everything. So how does that inform the trajectory of our relationship in the future? Because these were critical constituents of forming it till now, if you take the strategic aspect and China aside.
Where did you go first?
Sure.
I just spoke.
So I think that what's going on right now is sort of a renegotiation of the rules of the game, if the game is economic and trade. It's not that the game is over. And that's across the board, right? This is, again, an exogenous negotiation that's taking place across the world, not just with the U.S. and India. When I think about the challenges right now in the trade relationship, I think that we're getting hung up over some very minor issues. If you look at actually some of the things like Harley-Davidson's tariffs, and you're not actually talking about hugely consequential numbers that are occupying a lot of, and I'd say a disproportionate amount of policymakers' time. And despite those challenges, you're still having a steady growth in the trade flows. So this is one of those issues where I think despite sort of the dysfunction of government, the power of the market here is going to just sort of wash that away ultimately. I'm not as concerned about that. The immigration in terms of H-1B, that will change. But I don't think it's going to have a long-term consequence on the total sort of exchanges. It will affect sort of the percentages of how many Indians come here from an H-1B standpoint, but the total flows I don't expect to change. So I think I'd leave it at that. Ambassador?
I think in the broader scheme, we will have to look for ways and means to overcome these hurdles, particularly in regard to trade. Now, the GSP, for instance, is one such issue. The IPR issue under 301 is another issue. So we have to look at this thicket and run that gauntlet separately from the larger requirements of our global strategic partnership, and I think we can get there. It'll require the right kind of negotiations, the ability to draw a slight distinction between friend and foe. If we value partnerships, if we value, in the case of the United States, for instance, alliance partnerships, then maybe a one-size-fits-all approach may not always work. I mean, I remember in a previous session, the Japanese were asking me what would be my take on the fact that large automobile companies from the Japanese establishment are reeling under pressure because of the trade war between, if I can put it that way, between the United States and Japan, which is an alliance partner. But I think we'll overcome these issues. I don't see them as fundamentally disruptive of the trajectory in which we are moving.
You have a question?
Hey, I'm Maria. I'm a reporter for Inside U.S. Trade. I just wanted to follow up on GSP benefits. After India's elections wrap up next week, how and when do you think those discussions could be rekindled? Thanks.
I think it'll be up to the trade negotiators to decide when they will meet, and I'm assuming they're constantly in touch. But I can't give you a date or a specific time frame in which this will get done.
Your follow-up?
You should ask Ben this because, with the hat that he wears is of the industry side as well, and he'll know a lot more than
Well, I don't think I could give a more satisfying answer because I don't know the details of the negotiation time frame, and if I did, I probably wouldn't be in a position to share that because it is a negotiation, and part of the negotiation is not joining the table, or at least conveying that you're willing to, stick with the current arrangement. So, as I said, my hope is that somebody has sort of in a decision-making position has sort of a longer-term framework, and because a lot of the issues that are on this sort of being discussed and are at the front and center of this are not what I would call hugely significant from a strategic perspective, right? They're not huge numbers in terms of revenue, and they're not like consequential from a political standpoint. So my hope is that there will be give and take in a productive way. But I apologize, I can't give you the details on that.
Yes, I'm Russell King, a retired federal employee. I have a question for the ambassador about North Sentinel Island, part of the Andaman Islands. North Sentinel Island is a rather primitive island where I don't think India has quite the governance they do in other parts of India, because some fishermen were shipwrecked there, they were murdered. And then during the 2004 tsunami, I think the Indian Coast Guard went to check up on the North Sentinel Island, and they shot arrows into the helicopter, I believe. But can you tell me a little bit about North Sentinel, and isn't it inconsistent to have a governance of an island that where murder, they actually get away with murder? I know that's a primitive culture, and they're having a problem with diseases, introducing diseases and that sort of thing. But can you tell me a little bit about North Sentinel Island?
Firstly, we are approaching this and looking at it from very different ends. As far as India is concerned, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are a very unique ecosystem with a very strong anthropological history to that place. So this entire chain of islands running almost 1,000 kilometers from north to south, numbering roughly 800. The North Sentinel Island is in fact home to some of the oldest tribes on earth. They have a certain lifestyle which under Indian law is protected. In fact, no person is allowed to go anywhere near there. It's a complete violation of the law. It's illegal to go anywhere near the island. There is no desire or intention to put modern societal definitions of governance in place there, as in getting them to wear our clothes, eat our food, adapt to our ways of life, because what we are doing is showing deep respect for their way of life. This must be one of the last bastions on earth where such respect is being shown for a certain way of life that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. And it's not an area that is neglected in any way. The Indian Tri-Service Command there is in complete control of that entire chain. It's an extremely important geostrategic space. It straddles some of the key 9-degree, 10-degree channels and slocks. It overlooks one of the key choke points and passageways through the Malacca Straits. But the key point I'm making here is that it's out of bounds. So even on a golf course, you abide by the rules of the golf course, right? And you play on the fairway. You don't play in the out of bounds area. This is out of bounds. So people go there at their peril. The law that we have for that place is very different. In fact, the Indian government has taken even stricter action with regard to some of the other tribes, where tourists, despite the law being in place, try to give their food and make them perform certain tribal dances just for their entertainment. It's all very illegal. So we wish to protect this area, show respect, so that we regard their way of life as sort of sacred, as in they're allowed to live their life. Besides, there is this problem of viruses and stuff like that. So there's very little contact with the outside world. It's occasionally the Indian Navy that goes across and perhaps pushes across some coconuts and other things, plantains on a raft, and they receive it. So that's how it is. It's the law of the land that applies there. It's totally out of bounds. And it remains what it was 10,000 years ago, maybe 40,000 years ago.
Thank you. My name is Pinal Patel. I go by Jay, and I have two questions. I was recently engaged as an appointee at USAID and withdrew, but I thought this was kind of interesting. Given I have deep history and relationships in India, my grandfather's cousin brother is Sardar Vallabh Patel, and so that's our family history. from India. I've been here 35 years, and so there's really just one question that I thought might be of interest to me anyway, is given the relationships that you outlined, Ambassador Chinoy, you know the evolution of the history quite well. If it was a bias-free advice that you would give to our PM, should he get reelected here as we go through that process now, and it looks like pretty good shape, I think it may end up at that. What's the advice with regards to the relationship in terms of making progress with, whether it's with the U.S. or China in the next 3 to 5 years, bias-free advice? So what would the two things that you would potentially advise the leadership on?
Leadership here?
Yeah, leadership here and there, both in India.
Well, firstly, I'm not in the business of giving gratuitous or unsolicited advice, because you normally, ask for advice when you need it, you get it, But the point is that I think, given the current global scenario, ways will have to be found to engage in dialogue in order to resolve complex trade and other issues, and that, I suppose, is going on. Perhaps more of that will happen down the road. Nobody's really closed the door. There is a situation right now that prevails, but there's no guarantee that further dialogue will not be held. And I suppose it will be very important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, the trade relationship between two large economies is a complex one. So that's all I can say. As far as India is concerned, our real priority, I think, is to ensure that we have a peaceful periphery, that we are able to create the right kind of conditions in which India's economy can emerge and grow rapidly, and that we are able to take inclusive development to the last man and woman and child in India. And we would like to partner countries like Japan, notably, and the United States of America in all our flagship programs to make that happen. We would also, alongside, not be indifferent to the requirements of national security. And so, as Ben has spoken earlier about budgets and priorities and things like that, I assume we will have to do a lot more to ensure that we have enough and adequate funds for capital expenditure, preferably through license production and transfer of technology, which gives us bigger bang for the buck, and also to ensure that we are able to stem and stave off this very, very harmful threat of terrorism on our borders. So this is our topmost priority. So we'd like to be allowed to grow, and that automatically will be contributing to stability in the region. If India truly grows and acquires more economic power and is able to present a more robust military preparedness, automatically it's good for the region, isn't it?
Any more questions? Last few questions?
Ben, you mentioned this before, but could you elaborate a little more on how the U.S.-China trade war may impact India economically?
So one of the things that's happening is you're seeing a strong push to get American companies that have moved manufacturing to China to find alternatives, right? One option is for them to bring resources back to the United States. Another option is for them to find something between China and here. And India, in many ways, could be a great environment for the manufacturing, for other types of investment, things like that. That's one very clear, I think, area where the relationship could benefit as a side product of the larger U.S.-China sort of tensions.
I would agree with Ben, because it's very important for India to not just develop its economy in a kind of isolated fashion, relying solely on the domestic market, but as India emerges, it's integrating more at the global level. We need to be a part of major supply chains, especially those involving high technology. And we obviously will do what it takes to create the right kind of receptacles and put in place policy frameworks that ensure that greater amounts of foreign direct investment from multiple sources flows into India. If there are supply chains that are moving out of certain parts of Asia, I assume it's part of risk mitigation strategy on the part of investors who may not wish to put all their eggs in one basket. And India offers a scalable alternative across a broad spectrum of areas. We are not operating in niche areas. There are multiple contenders that will vie for this kind of supply chain business and investments that are moving around in a fungible manner, coursing through the region. Vietnam does very well on electronics and semiconductors. Thailand does pretty well on automotive industry. But then you have this large economy that's India, which does and potentially can do a great deal more on multiple sectors. So I'm banking on that, our ability to create the right kind of policy framework where we will be able to match the zeal, ardor, and if I might put it, faith that investors will put into the Indian economy. We'll take those decisions.
Second row.
So good afternoon. Thanks for being here. This is a question for the ambassador. My name's Amrita from Boeing. My question was just with all of the defense trade that happened with India, what do you see as the next steps in terms of just collaboration for the future? You see a lot of industrial, partnerships in India, some technology transfers, a lot of defense trades. But what, in your view, would be the next level in terms of the partnership, in terms of defense trade?
Briefly, I think there will have to be more dialogue to ensure that what we do under structures such as the DTTI, the Pathfinder, projects and things like that, these can be translated into action on the ground. So that's a desirable aspirational objective. Within that framework, we will have to see how we can work the system to mutual advantage on the Indian side, because there is something called the acquisition process, which is outside the DTTI. There is something called the Defense Acquisition Council. And there is something called the procurement process. There is something called the long-term plans of the three services that identify their needs and requirements. So, and there is something also with regard to, for instance, industrial security. So we've got to bring all these to a very positive confluence of intent and purpose. That will require a fair bit of exchange of views between the two sides and how to overcome hurdles. And I assume that will get done. One other area where we hope there will be greater progress will be, I repeat this again, you heard it before, that there should be avenues for transfer of technology. There should be avenues for licensed production of the type that we have been used to over the years, which give us more latitude at a time when the budgets are ostensibly limited, and we need to do more within that finite framework. So how do we get there? And how do we ramp up that process which will get there? How do we meet each other's expectations as we try to get there?
Ben, you get the last 30 seconds if you want to add something.
So I'd conclude by saying that, as was noted before, the U.S. India relationship is unique. India is unique. You cannot maintain momentum through cookie cutter approaches to policy. But you also cannot convince decision makers to make exceptions unless there's positive momentum. Not just talking points, but like demonstrable progress on something. And as sort of the India watcher, an India watcher here in town, I'm always in a position to try to push that. So I think there's been a lot of success in recent years in winning sort of the geopolitical argument for the partnership among people within the Beltway to some extent. But we have not yet won sort of the argument in the boardrooms, right, where the bean counters are moving money. And I think that needs to really be focused on like a laser beam. I think that there needs to be real clear sort of wins in terms of the trade and the investment and things like that, so that we can keep making exceptions here in DC and making that case.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the panel. Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. Thank you, Ben and Vikram. And thank you to all of you for coming here. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much.